Hello, and welcome to the Centre for Brexit Studies YouTube channel. Today we're joined by our researcher, David Hearne. David, more than 60 Conservative MPs have continued to defy Boris Johnson's calls to move on from Dominic Cummings' crisis. And this controversy doesn't actually seem to be disappearing anytime soon either. What impact do you think Boris Johnson standing by Dominic Cummings and going against many of the backbench MPs actually have on the Conservative Party?
Well, Johnson came into this with a huge amount of political capital. After his illness, he was the strongest he has ever been, and probably the strongest he was ever going to be. And it's clear that he's spending a significant amount of that political capital trying to keep Dominic Cummings in post. It's difficult really to understand why this is so totemic in its importance. I mean, cabinet ministers have had to resign for much less. So it really is difficult to see. It's hard to see the benefit for him unless there is something else going on under the scenes. And of course, it weakens his standing significantly when 60 of his own MPs continue to defy his calls and ask for Mr. Cummings to resign.
So the coronavirus test and trace system kicks off in England and Scotland from today. The aim of the system is to lift the blanket lockdown restrictions and move towards a more localised, targeted measures. So could we be expecting lockdown depending on the area where you live in the coming weeks then?
Eventually, I think that's something that would make sense. That's something that might well end up happening. Some would say it should end up happening. I would say we're very, very late to the party. As is a lot of Europe, the UK is not unique in this. Europe, the United States, etc., have handled this crisis quite badly relative to East Asian nations. If you look at South Korea, for example, or indeed Taiwan, Singapore, all have successful systems in place to try and keep the economy moving, keep people able to go about their everyday lives, whilst aggressively targeting the disease and those who might have it. So in that vein, the UK is very late to the party. The test and trace system that we currently are operating, certainly in England, is, well, I think it's been admitted it's not world beating. I think that's a little bit of an understatement. It's quite rudimentary relative to a lot of the more aggressive schemes internationally that I've seen. And I think an important limitation is the lack of focus on asymptomatic carriers, which we think might, although obviously there's a huge amount of uncertainty, be responsible for a significant portion of total infections. So in that sense, I think it's brilliant that we're doing it. It's a great start. It's too late, but we're going to really need to work on improving the system before we can think about completely lifting lockdown. I'm sure elements of it will be relaxed, and hopefully there will be areas that can move out of such stringent restrictions on everyday life, but we shall see.
So the Brexit deal could bring advantages to Northern Ireland, giving it access to both the UK market and the EU single market. That's according to DUP Minister Edwin Poots. But any advantages would be dependent on minimising new checks between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. How could this work?
So for me, it's ironic that the DUP have kind of finally making this point. They fought this deal tooth and nails. They even fought against Theresa May's deal, which would have kept Northern Ireland much more closely aligned with the rest of the UK. And this deal obviously casts Northern Ireland in some ways adrift from Great Britain. So it's kind of ironic to hear the DUP now finally making this argument, especially as this is something that a number of us had pointed out. There is the possibility that Northern Ireland will be in a somewhat advantageous position. That will depend on all sorts of things. It will depend on the kind of deal that Great Britain gets with the EU. It will depend on elements of the free trade agreement, and it will depend also on how well the Northern Irish exploit that. It will depend on their own government, and it will depend also on the nature of checks in the Irish Sea between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. Now, it's in everybody's interest. Everybody wants to minimise these. However, we are legally obliged to carry out certain checks. The level will depend on the agreement that we have with the EU, but there will certainly need to be, I would imagine, more stringent sanitary and phytosanitary checks in particular on goods moving into Northern Ireland, and probably quite a few other checks as well. So one can imagine that there would be significant friction introduced on goods moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. In terms of goods moving from Northern Ireland into Great Britain, that might be a slightly different kettle of fish. The UK retains substantial control over that, so we have the flexibility to try and move in a direction that would be advantageous to Northern Ireland. Whether Whitehall does is a completely different matter.
Thanks for joining me, David.
Thank you.